I'm Ainsley and I'm 24. The Christmas turkey was still warm on the table when my mother called me a wait dead, and my father suggested I find somewhere else to spend the holidays. Apparently, telling your family you lost your job makes you a liability to their carefully curated Christmas image. The words hung in the air like smoke from blown-out candles, suffocating what little holiday spirit I had left. You're telling us this now? Mom's voice cut through the dining room like a carving knife. On Christmas Eve? During dinner? Her perfectly applied lipstick didn't move much when she spoke, as if expressing genuine emotion might crack her foundation. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. If you've ever felt completely abandoned by the people who should love you unconditionally, you'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. I'd rehearsed this conversation during the entire drive from my apartment. Senior marketing coordinator at Henderson and Associates. 3 years of climbing the ladder, working weekends, being the reliable one. The layoffs hit everyone, but somehow admitting it out loud felt like confessing a crime. Maybe because, in their eyes, it was. Dad set down his fork with deliberate precision. How long? His tone suggested he was calculating damage control rather than offering support. 2 weeks. I pushed mashed potatoes around my plate, avoiding eye contact. I've been applying everywhere, but with the holidays, 2 weeks and you're just telling us now? Stephanie, my stepmother, chimed in from across the table. She'd been part of our family for exactly 18 months, but somehow felt entitled to opinions about my life decisions. That's concerning, Ainsley. Really concerning. The thing about family dysfunction is it never announces itself with dramatic music. It creeps in during ordinary moments, like when you're reaching for the cranberry sauce and realize nobody's actually listening to your answer. They're already 3 steps ahead, calculating how your problems might affect them. We had plans to announce something special tonight, Mom continued, glancing at my half-brother Marcus, who was somehow managing to look both smug and embarrassed simultaneously. Marcus got the promotion at the firm, junior partner at 26. Of course he did. Marcus, the golden child with his perfect wife and perfect credit score and perfect ability to never disappoint anyone. I forced a smile that felt like swallowing glass. That's wonderful, Marcus. Really. The thing is, Dad said, dabbing his mouth with his napkin, we can't have someone who's struggling around potential clients. You understand. Image matters in this business. Image. There it was. The word that had governed every family gathering, every conversation, every relationship in this house since I was old enough to understand disappointment. Not my well-being, not my feelings, not even basic human decency during the holidays. Image. So what are you saying exactly? I kept my voice steady, though my hands were trembling under the table. Mom exchanged a look with Dad. One of those married couple telepathic conversations that excluded everyone else. We think it's best if you figure things out on your own for a while, just until you get back on your feet. Translation: leave now, and don't come back until you're successful enough not to embarrass us. The dining room fell silent, except for the grandfather clock ticking away what remained of my Christmas. Stephanie cleared her throat uncomfortably. Marcus studied his plate. Mom reached for her wine glass. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Well, I guess that settles it then. My voice sounded remarkably calm for someone whose world was imploding. Thank you for the lovely Christmas dinner. Ainsley, don't be dramatic, Mom said, not looking up. Dramatic, right. Because asking for basic human compassion during a difficult time was theatrical. Because expecting family to act like family was unreasonable. Because wanting support instead of judgment was somehow an overreaction. I walked to the coat closet and grabbed my jacket, my movements mechanical and precise. Nobody followed me. Nobody called my name. Nobody suggested we talk this through like adults who supposedly cared about each other. The front door closed behind me with a soft click, and I stood on the porch where I'd posed for countless family photos, breathing in the December air that burned my lungs. Christmas lights twinkled on neighboring houses, each one representing families who might actually comfort each other during hard times. But something inside me had shifted during that conversation. Not broken exactly, but crystallized, clear. I had always known where I stood in this family hierarchy, but now it was official. The drive back to my apartment should have taken 40 minutes. Instead, I found myself taking the long route through downtown, past the office building where I'd worked until 2 weeks ago, past the coffee shop where I'd optimistically submitted applications on my laptop, past the life I'd been trying so hard to rebuild. My phone buzzed against the passenger seat. Mom, probably calling to tell me I'd forgotten something, or to soften the blow with some conditional offer of help that came with more strings than a marionette. I let it ring. The snow started falling just as I merged onto the highway, fat flakes that caught in my headlights like tiny dancers performing their last show. By the time I reached the mountain pass, The roads were slick enough to make even confident drivers nervous. Perfect weather for perfect endings to perfect disasters. My gas gauge hovered just above empty, but stopping felt impossible. Moving forward was the only thing keeping me from completely falling apart in my car. The radio played Christmas songs that felt like personal attacks. Silent night, holy night. All is calm, all is bright. Nothing about tonight was calm or bright. Everything was chaos and darkness, and the kind of loneliness that settles into your bones like winter cold. I thought about calling Charlotte, my college roommate who'd moved to Denver last year. But what would I say? My family disowned me on Christmas Eve because I'm unemployed? She'd be appropriately outraged, offer to book a flight, insist I come visit immediately. All the right responses that somehow felt wrong. This wasn't the kind of problem that could be solved with best friend intervention and wine. The windshield wipers struggled against the thickening snow. My Toyota was reliable, but it wasn't built for mountain passes in blizzard conditions. Each mile felt like a negotiation between me and the weather, between forward momentum and the gravitational pull of everything behind me. That's when I saw the hazard lights. 2 dim orange dots blinking through the snow on the shoulder ahead. A car pulled over, nearly invisible except for those desperate little signals. In weather like this, that usually meant trouble. Real trouble. The rational part of my brain said, keep driving. I had enough problems without stopping for strangers on a dangerous road in the middle of the night. I was emotionally drained, financially unstable, and probably not in the best position to help anyone else. But something about those hazard lights reminded me of my own situation. Blinking desperately in the darkness, hoping someone would notice, hoping someone would care enough to stop. I eased my car onto the shoulder about 30 feet behind the stranded vehicle, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through my windshield, I could make out the silhouette of an older sedan, its back window partially covered with snow. This was probably stupid. This was definitely stupid. But apparently, getting disowned by your family on Christmas Eve does something to your decision-making process. Makes you care less about being smart and more about being human. I grabbed my phone, checked for signal bars. 2 out of 4. Not great, but workable, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit me like a physical blow. Snow immediately began collecting in my hair and on my shoulders as I trudged through the accumulating powder toward the stranded car. As I got closer, I could see 2 figures in the front seats, unmoving. My stomach clenched. Please don't be dead, I thought. Please don't let me find dead people on the worst night of my life. I tapped gently on the driver's side window. The window rolled down slowly, revealing an elderly man with kind eyes and a worried expression. His face was pale, and I could see his breath in small puffs as he spoke. "Oh, thank goodness," he said, his voice shaky. I was starting to think nobody would stop. "Are you okay?" I asked, already knowing the answer was no. The car felt cold even from outside, and I could see a woman in the passenger seat bundled in blankets, her lips looking distinctly blue around the edges. "The engine died about an hour ago," he explained. "No heat, and my wife, she has circulation problems. I tried calling for help, but my phone isn't getting any signal out here." An hour. They'd been sitting in a broken car without heat for an hour in this weather. My earlier problems suddenly felt embarrassingly trivial. "I'm Harold," he said, "and this is my wife, Dorothy." Dorothy lifted a trembling hand in greeting, but I could see she was in worse shape than her husband. Her breathing seemed labored, and she was shivering despite the multiple blankets. "I'm Ainsley," I said. "Let's get you both out of here." My car was still running, heat blasting, and it felt like a furnace when I helped Harold guide Dorothy to my passenger seat. She was smaller than I'd expected, frail in the way that makes you want to handle someone like precious glass. "The hospital," Harold said as I adjusted the heat controls. "She needs to get warm, and I'm worried about hypothermia." "Of course." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, explaining our location and situation to the dispatcher. The nearest hospital was 20 minutes away in good weather. Tonight, it might take twice that. "You shouldn't have stopped," Dorothy whispered as we began the careful drive through the storm. Dangerous for a young woman alone. I glanced at her in my rearview mirror. This tiny woman who was concerned about my safety while she was the one who'd been slowly freezing to death. I couldn't just drive past. Most people would have, Harold said quietly. We've been sitting there for over an hour. At least 20 cars passed us. 20 cars. 20 opportunities for someone to help, and every single driver had decided it wasn't their problem. The thought made me angry in a way that felt cleaner than the complicated anger toward my family. "Well, I'm not most people," I said, concentrating on keeping the car steady as we navigated a particularly slippery curve. "Besides, helping people is basically the only thing I'm good at these days." Dorothy's reflection caught my eye in the mirror. "You sound like you're having a difficult time yourself, dear." There was something about her voice, gentle and genuinely curious, that made my throat tight. When was the last time someone had asked about my well-being and actually wanted to hear the answer? Just family stuff, I said, keeping my focus on the road. Nothing that can't be fixed with time and distance. Family stuff is often the hardest stuff, Harold observed. The people who should love us unconditionally are sometimes the most conditional of all. His words hit so precisely that I had to blink back sudden tears. Here I was, driving strangers to the hospital, and somehow they were the ones offering comfort. The emergency room was bright and warm and efficiently chaotic in the way that hospitals are during night shifts. I helped Harold get Dorothy checked in, staying close while they processed paperwork and assessed her condition. Mild hypothermia, the attending physician told us an hour later. She'll need to stay overnight for observation, but she's going to be fine. You got her here just in time. Just in time. The phrase echoed in my head as I sat in the waiting room with Harold while Dorothy was settled into a room upstairs. If I'd driven straight home after dinner, if I'd ignored those hazard lights, if I'd been just a little more selfish. You saved her life, Harold said, as if reading my thoughts. Anyone would have done the same thing. He shook his head slowly. No, dear, they wouldn't have. We know because they didn't. The waiting room was decorated with tired Christmas garland and a small artificial tree. The kind of institutional holiday cheer that makes everything feel more depressing rather than festive. But sitting there with Harold, I felt something I hadn't experienced all evening. Purpose. Worth. The sense that I'd done something that actually mattered. Can I ask you something, Ainsley? Harold said. What were you doing out on that road tonight? It's Christmas Eve, and for some reason, maybe because it was late and I was tired and emotionally wrung out, or maybe because this kind stranger had just called me a hero, I told him the truth. My family kicked me out of Christmas dinner tonight, I said, the words coming easier than I'd expected. I lost my job 2 weeks ago, and apparently that makes me too much of a liability for their holiday celebrations. Harold's expression shifted from curiosity to something like angry disbelief. They what? Asked me to leave. Said they couldn't have someone who was struggling around their important announcement about my half-brother's promotion. I laughed, but it came out bitter. Image matters, you know. That's... Harold started, then stopped, shaking his head. That's unconscionable. The word hung in the air between us. Unconscionable. When family abandons you, you start questioning whether your reaction is proportionate, whether you're being too sensitive, whether you deserve what happened. Having someone else call it unconscionable felt like validation I didn't know I needed. Families can be complicated, I said, defaulting to the diplomatic response I'd perfected over years of explaining my family's dysfunction to friends. No, Harold said firmly. Complicated is disagreeing about politics or religion. Complicated is hurt feelings over wedding guest lists. What you're describing is cruelty. I studied his face, looking for signs that he was just being polite, but his indignation seemed genuine. You don't even know me. Maybe I am a liability. Maybe I am the problem. Ainsley, dear, you risked your own safety tonight to help complete strangers. You've spent the last 3 hours in a hospital waiting room making sure an elderly woman gets proper care. You wouldn't accept gas money when I offered it. Does that sound like the behavior of someone who's a liability? Put like that, it didn't. But years of being told you're the family disappointment leaves marks that don't fade easily, even when logic suggests otherwise. A nurse approached us around midnight. Mr. Patterson, your wife is asking for you. And she specifically requested that Ainsley come up too, if she's still here. Dorothy looked smaller in the hospital bed, but her color was much better, and she was no longer shivering. Her eyes lit up when she saw us. There's our angel, she said, reaching out to squeeze my hand. How can we ever thank you? You don't need to thank me, I said automatically. I'm just glad you're okay. Nonsense, if you hadn't stopped. She trailed off, but we all knew how that sentence ended. Harold pulled a chair closer to the bed. I told Ainsley what happened to her tonight, with her family. Dorothy's grip on my hand tightened. Oh, honey, on Christmas Eve? And suddenly, I was telling the whole story again, but this time to someone who listened like my words mattered. Dorothy asked follow-up questions, expressed appropriate outrage, and somehow made me feel less like a victim and more like someone who'd survived something difficult. You know what I think? Dorothy said when I finished. I think sometimes we have to lose the family we were born into before we can find the family we're meant to have. That's very philosophical for someone recovering from hypothermia, I said, making her laugh. 62 years of marriage teaches you a few things about love, she replied. Real love doesn't come with conditions. Real love doesn't evaporate when things get difficult. What your family did tonight wasn't love, sweetheart. It was performance. Performance. Like Dad's carefully timed napkin placement. Like Mom's strategic wine glass reaching. like the whole dinner being choreographed around Marcus's good news while my bad news was treated like stage direction to be edited out. The thing is, Harold added, Dorothy and I don't have children. We wanted them, but it wasn't meant to be. We've always said we'd know our people when we found them. There was something in the way he said, our people, that made my chest tight again. But in a different way this time. Not the crushing weight of rejection, but the expanding possibility of acceptance. You remind me of myself at your age, Dorothy said. Always trying to fix things, always putting other people first, always believing that if you just tried hard enough, you could earn the love you deserved. And what did you learn? She smiled, and for a moment, I could see the young woman she must have been. I learned that the right people don't make you earn anything. They just love you because you exist. The three of us talked until nearly dawn, about everything and nothing. They told me about their business, Patterson Import Company, which Harold had built from nothing over 40 years. Dorothy described their travels, their mutual love of classical music, their quiet life in a house that was probably too big for two people, but felt exactly right. I found myself laughing more than I had in months, genuine laughter that came from somewhere deeper than politeness or social obligation. When I finally left the hospital, promising to check on Dorothy later that day, the snow had stopped falling and Christmas morning was breaking clear and cold over the mountains. For the first time in hours, I thought about my family. They were probably having their traditional Christmas morning brunch right now, probably relieved that they didn't have to navigate my unemployment around the eggs Benedict and mimosas. But strangely, I felt more peaceful than angry. Meeting Harold and Dorothy had reminded me what kindness looked like, what genuine concern felt like, what it meant to be seen as worthy of care. My phone had 14 missed calls and 23 text messages, but I turned it off without reading them. Today felt like a day for new things. I slept until almost noon, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that only comes after emotional exhaustion meets physical relief. When I finally woke up, sunlight was streaming through my apartment windows, highlighting dust motes that danced like tiny celebration confetti. My phone, still turned off from the night before, felt heavy in my hands when I reached for it. 14 missed calls, 23 text messages, all from family members who apparently had things to say now that I was gone. I made coffee first, strong coffee. Then I sat on my couch, still in yesterday's clothes, and turned the phone back on. The messages were a predictable mix of guilt, manipulation, and damage control. Mom's texts started apologetic and grew increasingly frustrated as hours passed without response. Marcus had sent one message. Maybe we can talk when everyone calms down. Dad's voicemail was brief and businesslike. Call me when you're ready to discuss this reasonably. The word reasonably made me laugh out loud, because asking your unemployed daughter to leave Christmas dinner was so reasonable. I deleted everything without responding. Instead, I called the hospital to check on Dorothy. The nurse said she was doing well and would probably be discharged that afternoon. Harold answered when they transferred my call to her room. Ainsley, we were hoping we'd hear from you. Dorothy's been asking about you all morning. How is she feeling? Much better. The doctor says we can go home around 3 o'clock. But listen, there's something we need to tell you. Something important. My stomach clenched. People never prefaced good news with something important. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, dear. Dorothy's voice came on the line. Harold must have put it on speaker. It's just that we had an unexpected visitor this morning. The local news station sent a reporter, Harold continued. Apparently, someone at the hospital mentioned the rescue last night, and they wanted to do a human interest story. You know, Christmas Eve hero saves elderly couple, that sort of thing. My coffee suddenly tasted like ash. Please tell me you didn't. We told them the truth, Dorothy said gently, about how you stopped when dozens of other people didn't, about how you probably saved my life, about what kind of person does something like that. They want to interview you too, Harold added. The reporter asked for your contact information, but we told them we needed to speak with you first. I set down my coffee cup with trembling hands. A news story. About me, which meant my family would see it, and my former colleagues, and everyone who'd ever known me would suddenly have opinions about my business. I don't want to be on the news, I said quickly. I just helped someone. People help people every day. Not people who've just been through what you went through, Dorothy said quietly. Not people who had every reason to be bitter and self-absorbed, but chose kindness instead. That's exactly why they want to tell the story, Harold agreed. In a world where people drive past those who need help, you stopped. In a season that's supposed to be about compassion, you actually showed it. The reporter's name was Jessica Martinez from Channel 7 News. She called while I was still on the phone with Harold and Dorothy, and somehow I found myself agreeing to meet her at the hospital that afternoon. It'll just be a few questions, Jessica promised. Nothing invasive, Just a nice Christmas story about community and helping neighbors. But as I drove back to the hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than a simple human interest piece. News stories had a way of taking on lives of their own, and once something was on television, it became public property. Jessica turned out to be a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that put me immediately at ease. The camera operator was efficient and unobtrusive, and before I knew it, I was sitting beside Dorothy's hospital bed, telling the story of last night for what felt like the 100th time. "So you were driving home alone on Christmas Eve," Jessica said, "when you saw the hazard lights. What made you decide to stop?" I glanced at Dorothy, who nodded encouragingly. "I guess I knew what it felt like to need help and not get it. Can you elaborate on that?" And somehow, maybe because Dorothy was holding my hand and Harold was nodding supportively, I found myself telling the truth. Not the whole truth, not the specific details about being kicked out of Christmas dinner, but enough of it. "I just had a difficult evening with family," I said carefully. "Sometimes when you're going through something hard, it makes you more aware of other people who might be struggling too." Jessica's eyes sharpened slightly, the way reporters' eyes do when they sense there's more to a story. "A difficult evening? Family dynamics can be complicated during the holidays," I said, then immediately pivoted back to Harold and Dorothy. "But the important thing is that Dorothy is okay and going home today." The interview lasted about 20 minutes. Jessica asked about my background, my work, my thoughts on community responsibility. Standard human interest questions that felt safe and manageable. It wasn't until I was driving home that I realized what I'd potentially set in motion. Because in my experience, Christmas feel-good stories on the news had a way of reaching exactly the people you didn't want them to reach. The story aired during the 6 o'clock news on December 26th. I almost didn't watch it, but curiosity won over anxiety, and I found myself sitting on my couch with a bowl of leftover Chinese takeout, watching my own face on television. The segment was exactly what Jessica had promised. Heartwarming, focused on the rescue, positioned as a story about Christmas spirit and human kindness. They showed footage of the hospital, interviews with Dorothy and Harold praising my actions, and about 30 seconds of me talking about stopping to help. It was sweet, safe, completely unremarkable in the way that local news stories usually are. What I didn't expect was the phone call 20 minutes later. "Ainsley?" An unfamiliar woman's voice. "This is Sarah Martinez, Jessica's producer at Channel 7. I hope you don't mind me calling, but we've had an unusual response to tonight's story." My stomach clenched. "What kind of response?" "Well, it seems Harold and Dorothy Patterson are more prominent in the community than we initially realized. Harold's company employs about 300 people locally, and they're both major philanthropists. The story's getting picked up by other stations, and there's been significant social media interest." She paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "More importantly, the Pattersons called the station specifically asking to be put in touch with you. They have something they'd like to offer you personally." 2 hours later, I was back at the hospital, but this time in the administrative conference room with Harold, Dorothy, who'd insisted on staying an extra night for business purposes, and a man in an expensive suit who'd been introduced as their attorney, Robert Chen. "Before we begin," Harold said, "I want you to know that what we're about to offer has nothing to do with the news story. Dorothy and I made this decision at 4 o'clock this morning, long before any reporters were involved." Dorothy leaned forward in her wheelchair, still connected to an IV but looking much more like herself. "Ainsley, dear, what do you know about import business?" "Honestly? Almost nothing." "Perfect," Harold said, smiling, "because what we need isn't someone who knows import business. What we need is someone with integrity, intelligence, and the kind of character that makes them stop for strangers on dangerous roads." The lawyer slid a folder across the table. "Patterson Import Company has been looking for someone to head our new community outreach division. The position involves coordinating charitable giving, employee volunteer programs, and community partnership initiatives." I stared at the folder without opening it. "I don't understand." "We're offering you a job," Dorothy said simply. "A good job with excellent benefits that would allow you to use your natural talents for helping people in a professional capacity." "But you don't really know me," I protested. "We met 12 hours ago under unusual circumstances. You can't make career decisions based on one incident." Harold and Dorothy exchanged one of those married couple looks that communicate volumes without words. "Ainsley," Harold said gently, "in our 65 years of business, we've learned to read people quickly and accurately. We've also learned that skills can be taught, but character cannot. The salary is $65,000 a year to start," the lawyer added matter-of-factly, "with full health benefits, retirement contribution, and 3 weeks paid vacation. 65,000, more than I'd been making at Henderson and Associates. More than I'd ever made in my life. I need to think about it," I said automatically. though my brain was already calculating rent payments and student loan installments, and the magnificent possibility of not having to choose between groceries and gas. Of course you do, Dorothy said, but while you're thinking, consider this. Sometimes the universe puts us exactly where we need to be at exactly the right time. You needed to be on that road last night, and we needed you to find us. There's one more thing, Harold added. We'd like you to be our guest for New Year's Eve. We're having a small gathering at our house, just close friends and family. We'd very much like you to be there. Close friends and family. The words hit differently when spoken by people who'd known you for less than 24 hours, but somehow saw your worth more clearly than people who'd known you for 24 years. As I drove home with the job offer folder on my passenger seat, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. We need to talk. This has gone far enough. This. As if my absence was a temper tantrum rather than a natural consequence of their choices. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt something close to gratitude. Not for what my family had done, but for what their actions had set in motion. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted before you can find everything you actually need. I pulled into my apartment complex and sat in the car for a moment, looking up at my modest second-floor window. Tomorrow I would call Harold and Dorothy and accept their offer. Tomorrow I would start building a life based on mutual respect rather than conditional approval. Tonight, I would order pizza and ignore my family's increasingly frantic attempts at contact and plan for a future that looked nothing like the one I'd imagined this time yesterday. Some Christmas gifts come wrapped in disaster, and some rescues work both ways. The call from Channel 7 came 3 days later, just as I was reviewing the employment contract Harold and Dorothy's lawyer had sent over. Apparently, their Christmas rescue story had gained significant regional traction, and the station wanted to do a follow-up segment. We'd like to have you in the studio, Jessica Martinez explained, along with Mr. and Mrs. Patterson if they're available. The story's been picked up by other markets, and there's been quite a response from viewers. Quite a response. In my experience, that phrase usually meant trouble was brewing somewhere in the background. What kind of response? Overwhelmingly positive, she assured me. People are calling you a Christmas angel, saying we need more stories like this. The Pattersons specifically requested that you be included if we do any follow-up coverage. An hour later, Harold called to confirm. Dorothy and I would be honored if you'd join us for the interview. There are some things we'd like to say publicly, with you there. There was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't just about feel-good television, but after 3 days of my family's increasingly hostile voicemails demanding that I stop this nonsense and come home to discuss things like an adult, the idea of being somewhere I was actually wanted felt appealing. The Channel 7 studio was smaller than I'd expected, all bright lights and carefully arranged furniture designed to look casual while being precisely positioned for camera angles. Dorothy arrived wearing an elegant navy dress and her warmest smile, while Harold looked distinguished in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. You look nervous, dear, Dorothy observed as we sat in the green room waiting for our segment. I've never done live television before, I admitted. What if I say something wrong? There's no wrong way to be yourself, Harold said kindly. Besides, we'll be right there with you. The interviewer was a polished anchor named David Chen, different from Jessica, who apparently handled field reporting while David managed in-studio segments. He had that practiced television warmth that made you feel like you were talking to a friend, even though cameras were recording every word for broadcast. We're here with an update on a story that's captured hearts across the region, David began, looking directly into the camera. 3 days ago, we told you about Ainsley Crawford, a young woman who stopped to help strangers on Christmas Eve during a dangerous snowstorm. The segment showed clips from the original story, footage of the hospital, and photos Harold and Dorothy had provided of their rescue. Seeing it again, edited for maximum emotional impact, I understood why it had gotten attention. Joining us now are Ainsley Crawford and Harold and Dorothy Patterson, the couple whose lives she saved. Mr. Patterson, you wanted to come on the show today to make a special announcement? Harold leaned forward slightly, his expression serious but warm. That's right, David. Dorothy and I have lived in this community for over 40 years. We've built our business here, made lifelong friendships, tried to give back when we could, but we've never encountered anyone quite like Ainsley. She didn't just save our lives, Dorothy added. She restored our faith in human kindness. I felt my cheeks heating up under the studio lights. This level of public praise felt overwhelming, especially given how simple my decision to stop had seemed at the time. Now, Ainsley, David turned to me. You were driving alone on Christmas Eve when you saw the Pattersons' car. What was going through your mind? And there it was. The question I'd been dreading because answering it honestly meant revealing more than I wanted to share on live television. I was having a difficult night, I said carefully. Sometimes when you're going through something challenging, it makes you more aware of other people who might need help. Can you tell us more about that difficult night? David's question hung in the air, and I could feel Harold and Dorothy's supportive presence beside me. Behind the cameras, I caught sight of Jessica Martinez, who gave me an encouraging nod. This was the moment. Truth or careful deflection, safety or honesty. I took a breath and made my choice. I'd been fired from my job 2 weeks earlier, I said, looking directly into the camera instead of at David. When I told my family during Christmas Eve dinner, they asked me to leave. They said they couldn't have someone who was struggling around their important family announcements. The studio fell silent. I could see David's professional mask slip slightly, revealing genuine surprise at the direction this interview had taken. They asked you to leave on Christmas Eve? David's voice carried a note of disbelief. Image matters, apparently. The words came out with more bite than I'd intended. But honestly, after days of my mother's voicemails explaining why I was being dramatic and unfair, the truth felt refreshing. So yes, I was driving home alone on Christmas Eve, feeling pretty sorry for myself when I saw those hazard lights. Dorothy reached over and squeezed my hand. "What happened to you that night was unconscionable," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from 70-plus years of not tolerating nonsense. "No family should abandon someone during their most vulnerable moment. Which brings us to why we're here," Harold said, smoothly steering the conversation. "Ainsley, Dorothy, and I have a question for you." Oh, this was why they'd wanted me here for the follow-up interview. Whatever they were about to ask, they wanted it witnessed and recorded. "We'd like to offer you a position with Patterson Import Company," Harold continued, head of our new community outreach division. "It's a role that would let you use your natural compassion and intelligence to help coordinate our charitable giving and volunteer programs." David looked between us, clearly realizing this interview had become something much bigger than a simple follow-up story. "This is quite an offer. Ainsley, what's your response?" I looked at Harold and Dorothy, these two people who'd known me for less than a week, but somehow saw my worth more clearly than family who'd known me for 24 years. "I'm honored," I said simply, "and I accept." The studio audience, which I'd barely noticed before, broke into spontaneous applause. David smiled, the kind of genuine expression that suggested this was why he'd gotten into journalism in the first place. "Now, some viewers have been asking about a reward," David continued, "whether there's been any discussion of compensation for your heroic actions." Harold and Dorothy exchanged one of their wordless married looks. "We did offer Ainsley a financial reward," Dorothy said. "A substantial one. And she turned it down," Harold added. "She said she didn't help us expecting anything in return, which tells you everything you need to know about her character," Dorothy concluded. David turned back to me. "So, instead of money, you're accepting this job offer?" "It's not instead of money," I corrected. "It's instead of charity. The job offer is based on what I can contribute, not what I've already done. There's a difference." What do you think will happen next when a story like this airs on live television and reaches thousands of people, including the family who kicked you out 3 days ago? "That's a very mature perspective," David observed. "Now, what would you like to say to viewers who might be facing their own family challenges during the holidays?" I thought about all the people who might be watching, people who felt invisible or unwanted or conditionally loved, people who wondered if they deserved better treatment, but had been convinced they were asking for too much. "Sometimes the family that raised you isn't the family that's meant to keep you," I said, looking directly into the camera. "And sometimes losing the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally is what creates space for finding people who actually will." The interview wrapped up with contact information for local volunteer organizations and a reminder that the holidays could be challenging for many people. Professional, heartwarming, exactly what local television was designed to deliver. It wasn't until I was walking to my car that I fully processed what I'd just done. I'd told the truth about my family on live television. I'd accepted a job offer in front of thousands of witnesses. I'd essentially burned every bridge back to my old life and committed to building something completely new. My phone was already buzzing with notifications, but for once I wasn't afraid to look at them. Some doors close so others can open. Tonight felt like the sound of new doors swinging wide. My phone didn't stop ringing for 3 days. The interview had aired during prime local news time, but clips were spreading on social media faster than I could track them. Facebook posts, Twitter threads, Instagram stories, all sharing the Christmas Eve rescue story with increasingly dramatic headlines. Young woman saves elderly couple after being kicked out of family Christmas dinner. Family abandons daughter for being unemployed, then she becomes local hero. This is what real Christmas spirit looks like. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive, but they were also brutal toward my family. People were posting things like, "What kind of parents abandon their child on Christmas?" And, "I'd be ashamed to show my face in public if I were them." By Wednesday, the story had been picked up by 3 neighboring markets. By Friday, it was trending regionally on social media. Marcus called first, his voice strained and carefully controlled. Ainsley, this has gotten out of hand. Mom's afraid to go to the grocery store because people keep recognizing her from the photos on social media. What photos? Facebook. Someone posted pictures from past family gatherings with captions about how fake our smiles look now. People are commenting on our business pages, Mom's volunteer organizations, even my law firm's website. I felt a flicker of something that might have been guilt, but it was quickly replaced by a clearer emotion: consequences. For the first time in our family dynamic, actions had meaningful repercussions. I'm sorry people are being cruel, I said, and I meant it. But I told the truth, Marcus, nothing more, nothing less. You told the truth on television, he shot back. To thousands of people. You made us look like monsters. I made you look like people who kicked their unemployed daughter out of Christmas dinner, I corrected. Because that's what happened. Dad called next, his approach more strategic. We need to meet, as a family. Figure out how to fix the situation before it damages everyone's reputation permanently. Fix what situation? The one where you asked me to leave Christmas dinner, or the one where I told people about it? Don't be obtuse. Ainsley, you know what I mean. But I didn't know what he meant. Or rather, I knew exactly what he meant, and it was the same manipulative language pattern that had governed our family for years. My feelings were obtuse. My perspective was dramatic. My truth was a situation that needed fixing. I'm not interested in damage control. Dad, think about your family's reputation. I am thinking about my family's reputation, I said calmly. Harold and Dorothy's reputation, my new family. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Mom's approach was the most predictable. Emotional manipulation wrapped in victim language. Her voicemail, left at 2 a.m. on Saturday, was a masterpiece of guilt-driven rhetoric. Ainsley, honey, I don't understand what's happened to you. This isn't the daughter I raised. You're letting strangers turn you against your own family. These people don't really know you like we do. They don't love you like we do. You're making a mistake that's going to hurt you more than it hurts us. Please call me so we can work this out before you do something you can't take back. I listened to it twice, trying to find any acknowledgement of responsibility, any suggestion that maybe, possibly, they had handled Christmas Eve poorly. Instead, it was all about my choices, my mistakes, my misguided independence. The most interesting call came from Aunt Rebecca, Dad's sister, who I hadn't spoken to in over a year. I saw the interview, she said without preamble. Good for you. Rebecca? Your parents are furious at me for saying this, but someone in this family needs to tell you the truth. What they did was inexcusable, and you handled it with more grace than they deserved. Thank you, I said, surprised by how much her validation meant. Your father called me asking if I'd talk sense into you. I told him the only person who needed sense talked into them was him. She paused. I also told him that maybe this public embarrassment would teach them something about how to treat people they're supposed to love. By the end of the week, I'd received job offers from 2 other companies, interview requests from 3 different news stations, and invitations to speak at local community groups about resilience and family boundaries. The attention was overwhelming, but beneath it was something more valuable. Validation that my experience was real, that my feelings were legitimate, that I wasn't crazy for expecting better treatment from the people who raised me. Harold and Dorothy called every day, checking on how I was handling the media attention and making sure I felt supported. We're so proud of how you're handling all this, Dorothy said during one of our conversations. You're showing people what dignity looks like. Sunday evening, exactly 1 week after the interview, I was grocery shopping when I overheard 2 women talking in the checkout line. Did you see that story about the girl who saved those people after her family threw her out? Oh, yes. The Christmas Eve one. I felt so bad for her. What kind of parents do that to their own child? Standing there with my cart full of ingredients for the first home-cooked meal I'd felt like making in weeks, I realized something had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer the family disappointment, or the unemployed daughter, or the person who couldn't get her life together. I was Ainsley Crawford, the woman who stopped to help strangers and told the truth about what love should look like. For the first time in my adult life, my public identity matched my private sense of self. Some bridges are worth burning if they're the only way to reach solid ground. 2 weeks after the interview, my entire family showed up at my apartment. I was working from Harold and Dorothy's house, learning about import regulations and community partnership protocols, when my neighbor Mrs. Chen called to warn me that there were 4 people sitting in cars outside my building. They've been there for about an hour, she said. Should I call someone? I sighed, knowing exactly who they were. No, Mrs. Chen, they're family, but thank you for letting me know. The confrontation I'd been avoiding was apparently coming whether I was ready or not. I drove home slowly, taking time to prepare mentally for whatever drama was waiting in my parking lot. Mom, Dad, Marcus, and Stephanie were indeed there, looking like an intervention committee that had been planning strategy for hours. They followed me up to my apartment without invitation, filing into my small living room with the determined expressions of people who'd rehearsed their talking points. "We need to end this," Dad announced before I'd even closed the door. "The whole situation has gotten completely out of control." "What situation?" I asked, hanging up my jacket with deliberate calm. "Don't play games, Ainsley," Mom said, her voice tight with stress. "You know what this publicity is doing to our family? To our business? To Marcus's career?" I looked at my half-brother, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Is that true, Marcus? Is my honesty affecting your legal career?" "Some clients have made comments," he admitted quietly, "and Dad's firm has lost 2 major accounts. People are boycotting the real estate office," Stephanie added dramatically. "Our holiday party was basically empty because people are uncomfortable being associated with us." The consequences were more extensive than I'd realized, but I found myself feeling less guilty and more curious. These were people who'd built their entire social and professional lives on image management. Having that image publicly challenged was probably more devastating than losing an actual family member. "So what do you want from me?" I asked, settling into my armchair and not offering them seats. If this was going to be a power play, I wasn't going to make it comfortable. "A public statement," Dad said, pulling out his phone. "Something that clarifies what really happened. Explains that family dynamics are complicated and that your interpretation might not be the whole story. You want me to lie." "We want you to provide context," Mom corrected, "to show some loyalty to the people who raised you. Some perspective about how families have disagreements but work through them," Stephanie added. I looked around the room at these 4 people who shared varying amounts of DNA with me, but who had never really seen me as a person worthy of unconditional care. They wanted me to protect their reputation by undermining my own truth. "No," I said simply. "Ainsley, be reasonable," Dad started. "I am being reasonable. You asked me to leave Christmas dinner because I lost my job. That happened. I told people about it. That also happened. I'm not going to pretend it was something else to make you feel better about yourselves." Mom's carefully controlled composure finally cracked. "We are your family. We deserve better than this public humiliation." "Do you?" I asked. "Because families don't usually abandon each other during difficult times. Families usually offer support instead of judgment. Families usually choose love over image." "We do love you," Marcus said quietly. "You know we do." For a moment, looking at my half-brother's genuinely distressed expression, I felt the old familiar pull toward forgiveness. The ingrained response to smooth things over, to minimize my own hurt in service of family peace. But love isn't just a feeling you claim to have. Love is actions, choices, patterns of behavior that demonstrate care over time. "I believe you think you love me," I said gently. "But the way you show that love is conditional on my success, my usefulness, my ability to enhance rather than complicate your lives." I stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the parking lot where their cars sat clustered together like a barrier against the outside world. "I forgive you for Christmas Eve," I said, turning back to face them. "All of you. I forgive you for choosing image over empathy, for making my unemployment about your comfort, for deciding I was expendable when things got complicated." Relief flickered across several faces. "But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation," I continued. "Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen or that it won't happen again the next time I need support instead of judgment." "What are you saying?" Mom asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. "I'm saying I'm going to build relationships with people who love me consistently, not conditionally. People who see my worth as inherent, not dependent on my achievements or usefulness." "So that's it?" Dad's voice carried more hurt than anger now. "You're choosing strangers over your own family?" "I'm choosing people who treat me like family over people who treat me like a liability." The conversation continued for another hour, cycling through various appeals to guilt, duty, and family obligation. But I'd found something during those weeks with Harold and Dorothy, a clear understanding of what healthy relationships actually looked like. When they finally left, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because I'd rejected my family, but because I'd finally stopped accepting less than I deserved from people who claimed to love me. Some relationships are worth fighting for. Others are worth fighting free from. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a rhythm I'd never experienced before. Working for people who valued my contributions. Living without the constant weight of familial disappointment. Building friendships based on mutual respect rather than shared genetics. Harold and Dorothy had been right about my natural talents. The community outreach position turned out to be exactly what I didn't know I was looking for. Coordinating volunteer programs, managing charitable partnerships, organizing community events, It all felt less like work and more like finally using abilities I'd always had but never been encouraged to develop. "You have a gift for connecting with people," Dorothy observed one afternoon as we reviewed applications for the company's new scholarship program. "It's not just empathy, though, that's certainly part of it. You see what people need before they have to ask for it." We were sitting in her garden, a stunning space behind their historic home that Dorothy had been cultivating for 40 years. Roses climbed trellises beside carefully arranged perennials, and a small fountain provided background music to our conversation. "My mother always said I was too sensitive," I replied, sorting through essays from local high school seniors, "that I needed thicker skin if I wanted to succeed in the real world." Harold emerged from the house carrying a tray of iced tea and homemade cookies, a Saturday afternoon ritual that had developed naturally over the months. "Your mother was wrong," he said, settling into his chair with the careful movements of someone whose knees weren't as reliable as they used to be. "Sensitivity is a superpower when it's channeled correctly. The business world needs more people who understand human nature, not fewer." These Saturday conversations had become the highlight of my week. Harold and Dorothy asked about my goals, my interests, my thoughts on everything from literature to politics to travel. They remembered details from previous conversations and followed up on projects I was working on. They celebrated my small victories and offered gentle guidance when I faced challenges. It was the kind of attention I'd spent my entire adult life craving from my biological family. "There's something we'd like to discuss with you," Dorothy said, exchanging one of her meaningful looks with Harold. "About your future with the company." My stomach clenched reflexively. After months of conditional family love, I'd developed an unfortunate response to conversations that began with, "We need to talk," or "There's something we should discuss." "Good news," Harold added quickly, apparently recognizing my expression. "Very good news. The board of directors has been reviewing your work," Dorothy continued. "The scholarship program you designed, the volunteer coordination system, the partnership you developed with the homeless shelter. They're all performing beyond our expectations. We'd like to offer you a promotion," Harold said. "Director of Community Relations, with a substantial salary increase and a seat on the company's advisory board." I set down my iced tea carefully, trying to process what they were telling me. A promotion after only 4 months. A salary increase that would mean financial security for the first time in my adult life. A voice in company decisions. "I don't know what to say," I admitted. "Say yes," Dorothy laughed, "unless you have other career plans we don't know about." "It's not that. It's just," I struggled to find words for what I was feeling. "I keep waiting for the conditions, for the expectations that come with strings attached." Harold leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "Ainsley, dear, the only expectation we have is that you continue being exactly who you are. The person who stops for strangers in snowstorms. The person who sees solutions where others see problems. The person who treats everyone with dignity regardless of their circumstances. We're not just offering you a job," Dorothy added gently. "We're inviting you to help us build something meaningful. A company that operates with integrity, that takes care of its community, that measures success in more than just profit margins." That evening, I called my old college roommate Charlotte in Denver to share the news. "This is incredible, Ains," she said, using the nickname that always made me smile. "But how are you handling all the changes? 6 months ago, you were dealing with family drama and unemployment, and now you're basically running community relations for a major company. It feels surreal sometimes," I admitted, "like I'm living someone else's life, but also like this is the life I was supposed to have all along, if that makes sense." "Perfect sense. You were never meant for that family's version of success anyway. You're too genuine for their performance-based approval system." Charlotte had always been able to articulate things I felt but couldn't express. Her perspective helped me understand that what I'd experienced with my biological family wasn't just disappointment. It was fundamental incompatibility. "Have they tried to contact you lately?" she asked. "Marcus sends occasional texts asking how I'm doing. Very surface level, very careful. Mom sends birthday cards with generic messages. Dad, nothing since the apartment confrontation. How do you feel about that?" I thought about it carefully. Relieved, mostly. A little sad sometimes, but more like mourning the family I wished I had rather than missing the family I actually had. Summer brought new challenges and opportunities. The scholarship program had attracted regional attention, leading to partnership requests from other organizations. I found myself speaking at business conferences, presenting at community meetings, representing Patterson Import Company as someone whose opinion mattered. Harold and Dorothy included me in family gatherings with their extended network of close friends and chosen family. I met their neighbors, their longtime business partners, their favorite restaurant owners who'd become personal friends over decades of consistent patronage. "This is Ainsley," Dorothy would say with unmistakable pride. the brilliant young woman who's revolutionizing our community outreach efforts. Being introduced with genuine enthusiasm rather than apologetic explanations was a revelation I hadn't expected. By autumn, when Harold asked if I'd be interested in accompanying them to a business conference in Chicago, I realized something profound had happened. I'd stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'd stopped expecting conditions and restrictions and disappointment. For the first time in my adult life, I felt genuinely secure in a family dynamic. December arrived with the kind of pristine snow that makes everything look like a greeting card, and with it came an invitation that would have seemed impossible 11 months earlier. "We'd be honored if you'd spend Christmas with us this year," Dorothy said as we reviewed year-end charitable giving reports in her warm kitchen. "It'll just be a small gathering. Our closest friends, Harold's brother and his wife, a few neighbors who've become family over the years. Christmas. The holiday that had once represented everything wrong with my family relationships was being offered as something warm and genuine and uncomplicated. I'd love that," I said, surprised by how easily the acceptance came. "Wonderful. And Ainsley, you don't need to bring anything except yourself. No obligations, no expectations, just come as you are. No obligations. No performance requirements. No careful navigation of family politics or unspoken rules about acceptable topics of conversation." Christmas morning, I woke up in my apartment feeling something I hadn't experienced since childhood. Excitement about the day ahead rather than anxiety about surviving it. I'd bought thoughtful gifts for Harold and Dorothy. Nothing expensive, but things that reflected my understanding of who they were as people. A first edition of a poetry book Dorothy had mentioned loving in college. A vintage map of Ireland for Harold, whose grandfather had emigrated from Cork in the 1920s. Their house was warm and alive with conversation when I arrived. The tree was decorated with what appeared to be decades of accumulated ornaments, each one clearly carrying a story. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and vanilla and whatever magical combination of spices makes a house feel like home. Ainsley, Harold's brother James, embraced me like we'd known each other for years rather than having met twice at company events. "Dorothy's been telling us about your latest project with the youth mentorship program. Brilliant work." The gathering was everything I'd never known family celebrations could be. Conversations that meandered naturally from current events to shared memories to future plans. Laughter that came from genuine amusement rather than obligation. Disagreements that were discussed respectfully rather than avoided or turned into battlegrounds. At dinner, seated around a table where every place setting felt equally important, Dorothy asked each person to share something they were grateful for from the past year. When it was my turn, I looked around the table at these people who'd welcomed me, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. "I'm grateful for learning the difference between being wanted and being tolerated," I said, "for discovering that family isn't determined by biology, but by choice. For finding people who see my worth as inherent rather than conditional. Here's to chosen family." Harold raised his glass. "To the people who love us for who we are, not who they think we should be." Later that evening, as we sat around the fireplace with coffee and dessert, Dorothy pulled out a wrapped package she'd been saving. "This isn't exactly a Christmas gift," she said, handing it to me. "It's more of a symbol." Inside was a delicate silver locket, antique but beautifully preserved. When I opened it, one side contained a small photo of Harold and Dorothy from their wedding day. The other side was empty. "The empty side is for you to fill however you choose," Dorothy explained. "With whatever represents the family you've chosen to build." I felt tears threatening, but they were different from the tears I'd shed a year ago. These came from abundance rather than loss, from recognition rather than rejection. "Last Christmas," I said, looking into the fire, "I was driving home alone on an icy road, convinced I was fundamentally unworthy of love. Tonight, I'm surrounded by people who've shown me what genuine care looks like. Sometimes we have to lose our way completely," Harold observed, "before we can find our true direction." My phone buzzed with a text message. Marcus sending his annual Christmas greeting. "Merry Christmas, Ainsley. Hope you're well." For a moment, I felt the familiar tug of sadness for relationships that might have been, but it passed quickly, replaced by gratitude for relationships that actually were. I showed the text to Harold and Dorothy, explaining briefly about my family's occasional attempts at surface-level contact. "How do you feel about that?" Dorothy asked. "Peaceful," I realized. "I don't wish them harm, but I don't need their approval anymore. I found something better." As the evening wound down and guests began heading home, I helped Harold and Dorothy clean up, moving through their kitchen with the familiar ease that comes from belonging somewhere. "Thank you," I said as we finished loading the dishwasher. "For everything. For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. For showing me what family is supposed to feel like." "Thank you," Dorothy replied, "for reminding us that love multiplies when it's shared freely." Driving home through the quiet Christmas night, I thought about the journey that had brought me here, 12 months ago, I'd been abandoned by people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Tonight, I was embraced by people who chose to love me exactly as I am. Some stories end with reconciliation, with prodigal children returning to families who've learned to appreciate them. But sometimes the better ending is discovering that the family you need was never the family you were born into. Sometimes home isn't a place you return to. Sometimes home is something you build with people who understand that love is a verb, not just a feeling. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't being forgiven by those who hurt you, but finding the courage to forgive yourself for accepting less than you deserved. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you discover that losing everything you thought you wanted creates space for finding everything you actually need. Where are you watching from today? If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories about finding your way home to the people who truly see your worth.